Babylonian brain drain. How exiled intellectuals preserved faith within a foreign empire in 586 BCE. The most powerful army on earth didn't just destroy a city. They handpicked its smartest people and took them home. Not as slaves. Not exactly. As assets. Nebuchadnezzar II's generals walked through the rubble of Jerusalem with a very specific list. Scribes, priests, scholars, anyone who knew how to think. And they marched them more than 1,000 kilometers into the heart of Babylon. The most advanced civilization on the planet at the time. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. The Babylonians believed they were emptying Jerusalem of its power. They thought stripping a people of its temple, its land, its king, would hollow it out entirely. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened next didn't just preserve a faith. It reinvented it, and that reinvention became the blueprint for how minority cultures survive inside empires. A blueprint that's still being used right now? Let's go back to the beginning. The siege of the mind. Most people think of conquest in terms of armies and walls. Nebuchadnezzar thought differently. When he looked at Jerusalem, a small, strategically significant city in the Levant, he wasn't just after territory, he was after human capital. His empire ran on knowledge. Babylon had engineers who built the world's first urban irrigation systems, astronomers who could predict lunar eclipses centuries in advance, and scribes who maintained administrative records across a territory stretching from modern-day Iran to Egypt. To run a machine like that, you need educated people. And if those educated people happen to come from conquered nations, even better. They were easier to control and carried no loyalty to existing Babylonian factions. The Book of Kings records that Nebuchadnezzar specifically deported all the officers and mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. The Hebrew Bible, the Babylonian Chronicles, and modern archaeological records from the Ishtar Gate excavations all confirm the same pattern. This was a deliberate, systematic extraction of the professional class. But here's what the Babylonians didn't count on. They brought these scholars into the most intellectually stimulating environment in the ancient world, instead of dissolving their culture. The encounter did something the captors never intended. It forced a crisis of identity so acute that the only way out was to write everything down. Before the exile, most of Israel's religious and cultural memory existed in oral tradition, stories passed from priests to people in temple courts, ritual practice tied to a physical location, a god understood primarily through proximity to a specific piece of land. Strip all of that away and suddenly you have a problem. Theological emergency. If God is everywhere, why did he let this happen? And if he allowed it, what are we supposed to do now? Those questions didn't destroy the faith. They turbocharged its evolution. The Royal Academy of Babylon. Now imagine being one of these scholars. You've watched your city burn. You've walked for months across desert and steppe. And then you arrive. Babylon is nothing like what you expected. It's massive. Herodotus would later describe it as a city so large it took 2 days to walk across. Wide processional avenues lined with glazed tiles, the Assimilate temple complex towering above everything, markets with goods from 3 continents. And at its intellectual core, the Adaba, the Babylonian Scribal Academy, one of the most rigorous educational institutions in the ancient world. Daniel 1-4 is striking in its specificity. The text describes the selection of captive youths who were skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, stand in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. 3 years of immersive education in Babylonian science, literature, astronomy, and statecraft. This was not torture. This was seduction. Babylonian astronomy was genuinely extraordinary. Cuneiform tablets from this period, now housed in the British Museum, show systematic records of planetary movements calculated with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 16th century. Their mathematics used a base 60 system. We still measure time in angles and multiples of 60 because of them. For a Hebrew scholar steeped in a tradition that explained the cosmos through divine narrative, sitting in a Babylonian classroom was intellectually disorienting. These weren't backward people. Their ideas worked. Their gods, Marduk, Ishtar, Nabu, had massive, sophisticated mythologies. Their creation epic, the Enuma Elish, was already ancient when the exiles arrived. And here's the tension that defined the entire exile. How do you maintain that your God is the only God when you're surrounded by a civilization that seems to contradict you at every turn and is thriving? The answer they arrived at was radical. Codifying a culture in flux, scholars now broadly agree that the Babylonian exile was the crucible in which much of the Hebrew Bible took its written form. Before 586 BCE, written texts existed, royal annals, legal codes, earlier prophetic writings, but they were fragmented, locally maintained, and tied to the temple system. When the temple was gone, the texts had to become the temple. This is where the intellectual class made their most consequential decision. They didn't just preserve the old stories. They edited, expanded, and theologized them with a new urgency. The priestly source, what biblical scholars call the P source, is widely dated to the Exilic period. It's obsessed with precision, exact measurements, genealogies, ritual detail. Why? Because precision is portable. You can observe the Sabbath in Babylon. You can maintain dietary laws anywhere. You don't need Jerusalem for that. The Sabbath itself was likely formalized as the central communal practice during this period for exactly this reason. Sociologist Robert Bellah, in his landmark work Religion and Human Evolution, describes this as a second-order religious shift, moving from embedded location-based faith to a reflexive, text-based one capable of surviving displacement. In other words, they invented portable religion, and they were doing it inside the belly of an empire that was actively trying to absorb them. Every week they gathered. Every week they read. Every week they rehearsed who they were, not as a nostalgic act, but as an act of resistance. The intellectual resistance. Here's the move that is genuinely underappreciated in popular history. The exiled scholars didn't reject Babylonian literary culture. They hijacked it. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, begins with a primordial chaos of water from which the gods emerge in conflict. Genesis 1, almost certainly compiled in its final form during or just after the exile, begins with a formless void, Tema, a word linguistically related to Tiamat, the chaos dragon of Babylonian myth. But in Genesis, there is no conflict. There is only one God. He speaks, and it is ordered. It is a theological rebuttal, dressed in borrowed clothes. The Book of Daniel, set explicitly in the Babylonian court, is a deliberate cultural inversion. Babylon's wise men can't read the signs. The exile can. Their God outperforms Babylon's gods on Babylon's own turf. This isn't just storytelling. It's ideological warfare conducted through literature. Meanwhile, something structural was changing. Communal identity no longer required a physical center. Synagogue worship, small, decentralized, text-based, likely emerged in this period precisely because it didn't require a temple. Scholars like Lee Levine and Seth Schwartz have traced the earliest forms of synagogue community to the exile and its immediate aftermath. This is where Nebuchadnezzar's plan collapsed. He thought he'd taken their power by taking their place. But the exiles had done something far more dangerous. They had untethered their identity from geography entirely. You cannot destroy what has no fixed location. Legacy of the portable faith. The Persian king Cyrus the Great would end the exile in 539 BCE. Many of the exiles returned. Many did not. But something had irrevocably changed. The faith that returned to Jerusalem was not the same faith that had left. It was harder, more defined, more resistant to assimilation. Not because it had closed itself off to the world, but because it had been forced to articulate, in writing, exactly what it was. The ripple effects are almost impossible to overstate. The text-centered, diaspora-adapted form of Judaism that emerged from Babylon became the ancestor of Rabbinic Judaism, which survived the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, using the exact same strategies. Christianity inherited the same portable, text-first architecture. Islam developed its own iteration of the same model, a faith designed to travel, to adapt on the surface while preserving a core. Historian Jan Asman, in Cultural Memory and Early Civilization, argues that the Babylonian exile represents one of the foundational moments in the development of what he calls cultural memory, the mechanisms by which groups preserve identity across time under hostile conditions. And here's where it connects to right now. Diaspora communities today. Ukrainian exiles, preserving language and liturgy since 2022. Hong Kong activists maintaining cultural archives in London and Toronto. Indigenous communities using digital platforms to preserve disappearing languages are running the same operating system the Babylonian exiles wrote in cuneiform and scroll. The platform changes. The strategy doesn't. A group of displaced scholars sitting in the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's palace under enormous pressure to forget who they were, chose instead to write it all down. To question it, argue with it, formalize it. To make it so legible that no empire could ever fully confiscate it. A choice born of crisis, refined under pressure, didn't just save one culture, it showed every culture after them how to survive. If this made you think differently about history, share it with someone who would never expect to care about 586 BCE.